Well, hello, my friends. Welcome to me, your host, Christian Watson. What is a woman? That single phrase, which to many people just seems as nonsensical as it is unnecessary, is potentially going to become the rallying cry of a generation, the defining motif of an age. Indeed, after the unfortunately, very likely future Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson was asked, "What is a woman?" by Tennessee Senator Marsha Blackburn, people absolutely went crazy. Because Ketanji Brown Jackson said that she cannot provide a definition of what a woman is because, and I quote, she said, "I'm not a biologist." Now, this got people going to social media and getting in an uproar. The RNC Research Center, the sort of information wing of the Republican National Committee, used that single clip and blasted it out. And of course, a day after that or so, Matt Walsh released his new project, The Daily Wire, where he asks the question, "What is a woman?" and he explores the intricacies of gender ideology. Now, my friends, as I was contemplating doing this video, I consorted with my audience. I talked with my audience and I asked them, and I said, should I do this? And many people were of the mind that this is such a common sense issue that has been beaten, the horse has been beaten by so many people, and there's possibly nothing new to add. And my friends, when I come to talk to you about these things, I want to make sure that I'm giving you something that you can take and plant into the ground that is the development of knowledge and have something beautiful blossom. I don't want to be repeating what 10 other pundits said to you about a particular issue. But as I went into my secret place and I began contemplating this phrase and what it means and all the things that are significant behind it, I realized one thing, my friends. No one is fundamentally asking the question, what lies beneath? See, when someone challenges our basically held beliefs, the beliefs that we have that are in common, a majority of this population has an idea and knows what a woman is. When someone challenges that, we assume that any retort to that should be constituted upon the grounds of common sense. Oh, well, what a woman is common sense. Ergo, we will not address that, and anyone who does is going against common sense. Well, look, as a follower and a believer in the natural law tradition, which influenced the foundation of the American experiment, I 100% believe in common sense. In fact, common sense is one of the many ways, one of the many windows we have into the existence of natural law, the idea that there are certain principles that are embedded into nature and embedded into human nature and can help us make moral and ethical decisions in society and abroad. I 100% believe in common sense because many natural law principles were held in common by people across the world throughout many time periods, even if they didn't profess them fully in their actions. However, how do I know what common sense is if I do not first ask the question, what is common and what about that which is common is sensible? I don't. So even in our attempt to endorse common sense, we have to confront the ideas put before us for what they are and not be too dismissive. So, what is a woman? Well, a woman is a human female who's capable of having a baby and typically has certain parts of their body that are distinct to a human male. Done. No. Well, yes, but no. That is a perfectly valid definition and that is a correct definition. But that definition completely misses the other side of the argument. My friends, this idea of what is a woman, questioning that, doesn't come out of a vacuum. Ketanji Brown Jackson, unfortunately, is not the first person to think this or to say something like this. She's probably the first Supreme Court Justice to profess that she does not know what a woman is, or she does not want to define what a woman is, rather, because I'm certain that she knows. But she's not the first person to think this. In fact, USA Today released an article right after this fiasco happened, and they said in this article, and I quote, "Scientists, gender law scholars, and philosophers of biology said Jackson's response was commendable." Okay, first of all, there are plenty of people who teach philosophy, but are not philosophers themselves. Any philosopher that looks at that and says, wow, that's commendable, has no love of wisdom. They simply have a love of bias and their own internal idea of what is true, not what is truly true. So they're not philosophers. They are people who may teach philosophy, but that's not the same thing as being a philosopher. though perhaps misleading. It's useful, they say, Jackson's response, that Jackson suggests that science could help Blackburn's question, but they note that a competent biologist would not be able to offer a definitive answer either. Scientists agree there is no sufficient way to clearly define what makes someone a woman, and with billions of women on the planet, there is much variation. This is one of the reasons why USA Today and publications like them, who have this sort of gravitas, this sort of eternal value impended upon them by people who read the news, are absolutely do not deserve their titles. Because guess what? Just because something is printed under the title of USA Today does not mean it is commendable or correct. And unfortunately, institutions have this habit of using their past reputations, using the corpse of their past reputations to impose inviolability, to impose eternal correctness upon themselves. So if CNN says something, or if USA Today says something, it's apparently more objective than if I say something, because I'm not with either of those networks. This is the problem. You cannot get away with making these kind of arguments just because you happen to be a brand name. And the foolishness of this argument is elucidated by one fact. Just because there are a variety of things does not mean we don't understand what sort of thing that variety is. This right here is a picture frame. There are all manner of picture frames. There are two different picture frames behind me. One is more modern, the other has a more non-modern style to it, for lack of a better word. But I still understand that they are picture frames because they abide by the general principle of what a picture frame is. I understand that a Maserati and a Chevrolet, both of them are cars. They're different sorts of cars, but they're still cars because they abide by the internal definition of what the heck a car is. Just because there are plenty of women around in the world, and trust me, there are, does not mean that there is not a common sense of what they are. Because guess what? If there was no common sense of what they are, how could we classify them on any level? How could we even say they're women? This is a self-contradictory statement that these people who quote philosophers can't even seem to snuff out. And this is another thing, man. This is another thing with this modern mediocre mind that is being pushed out through the media, that is being pushed out through these publications. They have no regard for truth. They don't even have any regard for themselves, because if they did, they wouldn't print crap like this. They would look at their premises and say, okay, does this make sense? But no, they don't want to do that. They want to go ahead and proceed with what they understand, rather than actually understanding if what they understand is a good thing or not. And I can tell this video is going to get me riled up. Excuse me. God help me. But so let's talk about philosophers. Because as I said, this idea does not come in a vacuum. These philosophers of biology, these scientists, so to speak, they're not the first to profess this. I think this idea is an amalgamation of what is called postmodernism, and this sort of movement that was back in the 50s and 60s and went out through history, that critiques and attacks Western values, that critiques and attacks the Enlightenment, thus being postmodern, and does so in a variety of ways by emphasizing the subjective. Now, and as it relates to gender, there is a woman I want you guys to know, if you had or what ready. Her name is Judith Butler, right here. Judith Butler is a sort of, she calls herself a philosopher. She's an academic, I'll say that much. She's an academic who is very interested in gender theory and feminist theory, and she's actually one of the most influential feminist gender-type academics on the planet today. She is an academic celebrity. She gets protested everywhere, and there are people who believe in some of the kind of things that Ketanji Brown Jackson seemed to profess or seemed to give lip service to, who quote Judith Butler incessantly. Now, Butler had a book come out called Gender Troubles in the 90s. And this book was essentially meant to be a critique of how feminists wanted women to be individuals, and they wanted women to use their identity as a means of interacting with politics. But what Judith Butler said in that book was that was a little bit too confined, because how can you just be a woman in a world where there's so many other kinds of oppression? You have to understand things not just as a woman or as a man, but as a woman who exists in the presence of all different kinds of oppression, racism, homophobia. This is her own words. Again, this is another version of the idea of intersectionality, the idea that various different identities are connected, and therefore to understand what's going on in reality, you have to understand how different forms of oppression intersect. That was Butler's idea. But what Butler actually did in that book, As she says in this Guardian interview here, she actually opened the floodgates and established this idea that woman was a category that can and should change, that there's no such thing as a simple definition for what a woman is. Let me read this from you. She says about her book, it was meant to be a critique of heterosexual assumptions within feminism, but it turned out to be more about gender categories. For instance, what it means to be a woman, listen to this, does not remain the same from decade to decade. The category of a woman can and does change, and we need it to be that way. Let me go back. You guys aren't hearing me. You guys are not hearing me right now. Judith Butler says this in her Guardian interview. What it means to be a woman. You guys aren't hearing me right now. You guys aren't hearing me. What it means to be a woman does not remain the same from decade to decade. The category of a woman can and does change, and we need it to be that way. So not only is she making a descriptive statement about what happens to the term of women, she's making a value judgment in which she affirms that which is happening as benevolent. Politically, securing greater freedoms for women requires that we rethink the category of women to include those new possibilities. The historical meaning of gender can change as its norms are reenacted, refused, or recreated. And this is where we get Butler's golden idea, which perfectly encapsulates why the what is a woman question is even a question in the first place. It is the idea of gender performativity. What is gender performativity? So, the idea is that in life, nothing is essentially original. We all exist in this space in which something has always been said or done in one way or the other. We all have these scripts that we walk into the moment we're born. And these scripts are basically filled out for us. Now, we can recreate the script or we can change the script, but the script is already set and written. For example, this is how Butler explains her idea. She says, performative speech acts are the kind that make something happen or seek to create a new reality. We'll get to that in a second. When a judge declares a sentence, for instance, they produce a new reality, and they usually have the authority to make that happen. But do we say that the judge is all-powerful, or is the judge citing a set of conventions, following a set of procedures? If it is the latter, then the judge is invoking a power that does not belong to them as a person, but as a designated authority. Their act becomes a citation, and they repeat an established protocol, going back to the first time a judge ever made a decision. That judge, even if that judge was like 100 years in the future, is still regurgitating what that first judge did, according to Butler. So it's performative because we're simply acting out in the script we're already given. Butler believes that all of us are given a set of tools in life, and even if we use those tools a little differently, we still fundamentally have a set of tools that we are given and that define how we see the world. Isn't that fascinating? Well, this then leads to the idea, the question of what is reality? What is real? And as has been noted by people who study Butler, Butler got a lot of her ideas from a variety of thinkers, some of them being Claude Lévi-Strauss, Victor Turner, Clifford Geertz, Edmund Husserl, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, I can't speak, George Herbert Mead, John Searle, a bunch of people you probably never heard of. But this particular idea here of our reality being created by words and language and not actual real stuff comes from a lad called Lacan, Jacques Lacan. I'm probably butchering that too. Now, Jacques Lacan was a French psychoanalyst, much in the tradition of Sigmund Freud. And he had this idea, again, that reality, or at least the reality that we exist in, is simply a product of words and language. Indeed, Lacan believed that the only real reality that exists outside of this reality we live in was called the state of nature, and the state of nature only happens in birth. Once we are born, according to Lacan, we are now bound to this script that Judith Butler was talking about, and we're simply writing on the script. So, as Lacan said, the real is impossible. And I'll quote from this article here. And this article says, it is impossible insofar as we cannot express it in language, because the very entrance into language marks our irrevocable separation from the real. Still, the real continues to exert its influence throughout our adult life since it is a rock against which our fantasies and linguistic structures ultimately fail. The real, for example, continues to erupt whenever we are made to acknowledge the materiality of our existence, an acknowledgement that is typically perceived as traumatic, although it drives Lacan's sense of jouissance. So, the real exists, reality exists, but it's not important, or rather, it's only important to the extent that it can be interacted with by a created reality. And this is postmodernism. And I'm sorry if this is too deep for some of you guys, but we need to understand where these ideas come from. Basically, to summarize, Butler, by the way of Lacan and Foucault, is essentially saying that reality is constructed, or the realities we live in, our societies, our churches, our schools, our very lives, which are surrounded by these different ideas, are basically structured by dominant ideas, and they are guided and created by language. And whoever uses language in a way that is prominent will get to dictate the reality. And so the idea about going back to women is that if someone has a certain idea of what a woman is, then that idea is what is enduring. But the moment someone else gets more power or goes into the fight and they can assert what a woman is, and that idea gets more power, it can include that as well. But it's a constant tension between these different ideas of what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a man, what it means to be anything. Now, there's a problem with a few of these ideas. Number one, it is improper to call social conventions a reality because it presumes that social conventions capture us. But my friends, just as I can set this camera right now and talk to you about these things and analyze them, I can analyze any social convention that exists out there. And I can do these things not simply because I was taught to or I have a script of people who have done it in the past, but I can do these things because by my very human nature, I have the ability to reason. And reason exists independent of any social circumstance. So I don't care what one of these postmodernists says, these mediocre thinkers say. I can reason independent of anything else because it is born in me. And this is what Butler can't answer. This is what Lacan can't answer. This is what Foucault can't answer. They put the cart before the horse. They assume that the cart guides the horse, but they forget that the horse is the only reason the cart can still move. Oh my God, you guys aren't getting this right now. We are the ones who created a lot of these social ideas. But that does not mean that reality bends to our will. And that also does not mean, by the way, that these social ideas are not based on reality in some way, shape, or form. The social convention of not wanting to take your neighbor's stuff is based on a reality of natural law, of wanting to respect one's right to their conscience, wanting to respect one's right to their own self-governance. And when I can, the more I can tie certain principles that are in society back to foundations, back to ideas that we can observe throughout history, the more this social reality stuff becomes nonsense. And if I can tie the relationship between man, property, and society back to nature, I'm going to tie the relationship between woman and society back to nature as well. Once again, it is improper to call a woman a category when a category is simply a catch-all term for a bunch of related things. But woman is fundamentally one thing. There's nothing else in nature like the female type, whether it be in the animal kingdom, whether it be in humanity. Both of the women in every context, the animal kingdom and humanity, have many of the same traits. A lioness is typically quite feminine and caring with the cubs, whereas a lion is much more harsh and rough. A lion can be caring, absolutely, but a lion is typically the predator, whereas lionesses most certainly, they can be predators as well, but they're more maternal and caring. We've seen this all throughout nature, and we've seen this reflected in society as well. Now, there's a difference between saying that these things exist in nature, therefore they must be. There are certainly women that are not feminine or caring or whatever. There are certainly women that are not at all how people think they should be or how they are supposed to be or whatever. But there are certain traits that tie back to an area, to a space where society is not there. And if we can look at this area where society, social influence has not tainted it, then can't we draw something from that? If I can look at nature and say, okay, female creatures tend to act this way, and male creatures tend to act this way, and I can see that behavior resembled in humans, who are also animals, by the way, then wouldn't that suggest a universal truth, an objective reality about what these things are? And the functions of men and women are also different as well. Men can't get pregnant. Just they can't. Some folks think they can because they have this idea that man and woman are socially constructed. But if this is the case, then how come you cannot show me a full-blown biological male actually giving birth to anything but you can show me a trans male, which is a different category. Trans men, who, by the way, I have no problem with trans men per se, or trans anyone. I don't have a problem with them. I have a problem with gender ideologues. I have a problem with people like Butler who want to push this stuff onto people. But a trans man who is biologically a woman still has the function to produce a baby, but that's not the same thing because that's a different category. So once again, if I can look at functions and I can identify what sex or what gender has certain kinds of functions, I can therefore establish an idea of what they are. But Butler is saying that we're not actually looking at biological reality, or we can't look at biological sex because the language around biological sex is tainted by social realities created by oppressors. And this is the problem. The fundamental flaw of Judith Butler's ideology is that she is responding to ideas that she presumes possesses everybody, that she presumes controls everybody, including the ability for people to actually look into them and question them and reckon them. And that just ain't true. Reality does exist. Reality exists independent of society. Society is encompassed in reality. In all honesty, society is simply a constituent of what exists. And if I can look at the laws of nature, if I can look at the law of gravitation, if I can look at all these different things, law of thermodynamics, I can observe them for their truth. I am able to look at the laws of nature as well and extract from them certain principles. And that is the principle of manhood, womanhood. That is the principle of natural rights. I can look at these things and see them. And Butler would have to answer the question, if all of our perceptions are dominated by social realities, then how come I have them ingrained in me before I even come into social realities? Even in the neonatal place like Lacan was talking about, I have these faculties developing and churning in me when I'm in the womb still. And even before I can understand language, by the way, because Lacan's argument is that the moment we come into language, we're possessed by it, but as a baby doesn't understand language at first. They have to grow into it. So even before I can understand language, there are still these functions within me. So once again, I found the real. I found reality. It's not existing in some book written by a priest. It's not existing in some set of conventions written by sexists, misogynists, or whatever. It exists around us. It exists around us. And this is the problem. We've put the cart before the horse, and so many people, not everybody, but a lot of people who are endorsing what Ketanji Brown Jackson said, don't have a concept of a reality independent from themselves. They don't. Judith Butler can't even tell us if she wants to be identified as a woman, as a they, or whatever. She said in the Guardian interview, well, they seems interesting. I don't know. It's people have always imposed these ideas of what I am onto me, and I never came out as gay, and it never happened to me. And I'm not trying to trivialize people who go through these very important psychological processes. I'm not trying to do that. What I'm trying to say is this: if you can quite literally amend words that have clear foundations in nature to your own and fit them to your will, and just willy-nilly make them mean what you want them to mean, and they mean nothing whatsoever. If woman can mean something today and then another thing tomorrow, then what does it truly mean? If there's no stability, then how in the world can I actually see, even under the postmodern definition, what a woman is? I can't. The human mind needs stability. The human mind needs something to correspond to reality, or else it just deals in abstractions and it stays involved in a fantasy land. And if we're in a fantasy land, this conversation, the freedoms of women, as Butler would say, become irrelevant. But one last thing, because this idea that we need these evolving definitions to protect women's rights or protect trans rights comes at an even steeper logical cost. It's the cost of cognitive dissonance. Because that statement right there, which Butler said, that we need these definitions to protect trans women's rights, presume the existence of those conditions, trans and women, both of which require some objective meaning to even be coherent in the first place. So by contradiction, by necessity, this idea contradicts itself. Not only that, my friends, but freedoms, I'm going to close on this one. Freedoms are not given to you, my brothers, my sisters. Freedom is within you. It resides strongly within your heart. The fire of freedom burns inside of you. It is indicative in your faculties, in your ability, in your free will, in your ability to act, think, do, love. Freedom exists inside of you, and the imposition on everybody else is for them not to harm you, not to take your stuff, not to violate the principle of self-governance, and to also respect your right to be left alone if you want to. These are things that we can see in ourselves, that we can deduce from our nature, that we can find are just and good. My friends, society does not control what a woman is. Perception does not control what a woman is. You don't control what a woman is. Reality controls what a woman is, as reality controls everything else. And guess what? Even in the face of society and perception, reality reigns resolute. Think on it. My friends, I love you guys so much. If you love me, patreon.com/officialcwatson or PayPal, officialcwatson@gmail.com, or please link to my Discord, which is in the comment section down below. Follow my Twitter @officialcwatson. I love you guys so much. Thank you so much for sticking with me. I know this was a dense video, but this is important stuff. And as always, my friends, please stay pensive. Bye, guys.